Ilara Vance considered the backyard her fortress. It wasn't manicured. It was wild and dense with old-growth hydrangea bushes, aggressive flowering weeds, and a towering, slightly cantankerous oak tree that shaded the entire western border. This small patch of earth, tucked away in the sleepy, forgotten corner of Havenwood, was the only thing she had left of her grandmother, the matriarch who had built a quiet, fiercely independent life here. By extension, this land was the only place Ilara felt truly safe, a sanctuary from the financial anxieties and the crushing loneliness that had defined her post-divorce years. The peace shattered. With the violence of a gunshot at 7:14 a.m., it wasn't the sound of her neighbor's perpetually broken lawnmower or the usual high-pitched chirping of the blue jays that ruled the oak. It was the sudden guttural roar of diesel engines, the metallic screech of a truck's air brake, and a concussion of impact that rattled the antique, single-pane glass in her kitchen window. She dropped the half-sliced lemon onto the vintage linoleum floor. The bright citrus smell, moments ago refreshing, instantly soured the air, a scent of impending ruin. Outside, where her prize-winning rose bushes met the aging chain-link fence, stood 3 figures and a bright yellow mini-excavator that looked obscenely large and brutally out of place against the backdrop of her pastel blue house. The fence itself was already gone, unceremoniously ripped out of the ground, leaving jagged concrete posts sticking up like broken teeth. Ilara didn't stop to put on shoes. She ran out onto the worn wooden deck, the cold morning dew instantly soaking her socks. "What in God's name are you doing?" she screamed, her voice hoarse with a fear that instantly eclipsed her initial rage. The 3 figures, all men in identical, unmarked gray uniforms, looked up with the detached, professional efficiency of a demolition crew arriving at the wrong address but proceeding anyway. One, a man with a square jaw, heavy-lidded eyes, and a clipboard, wearing a hard hat, stepped forward. This was Bryce. He looked to be in his late 30s, and his eyes, shielded by dark safety glasses, betrayed no expression, no hint of humanity. "Ma'am, we're with Sterling Development," he announced, his voice a flat, dead baritone, devoid of apology or empathy. "We have a legally issued easement for subterranean survey work on this property. You'll need to remain inside your residence for your own safety until the site is secured." "Easement? Survey work? This is my property! This is deeded land. You've destroyed my fence!" Ilara felt the cold wave of panic rising, washing over the heat of her initial fury. She pointed a trembling finger at the enormous clawed bucket of the excavator, now lowered threateningly over the spot where her favorite stone garden fountain used to stand. "I haven't signed anything. I haven't even been notified. You touch 1 more inch of this land and I'm calling the sheriff. Get off my property, now." Bryce barely glanced at the clipboard. He pulled out a laminated, official-looking document and held it out, not offering it to her, but displaying it like a shield to ward off inconvenient scrutiny. Notice was served to the registered owner of this plot, 412 Haven Lane, 3 weeks ago via certified mail. The work order is validated by the district court. Case file 204B. It specifies a right-of-way for a 20 by 20-foot exploratory dig centered on the coordinates previously identified by ground-penetrating radar. He recited the information like a machine reading an instruction manual. "This document authorizes us to proceed, with or without your explicit consent. Any interference will result in an injunction and criminal charges against the interfering party." The sheer, impenetrable wall of corporate and legal audacity took Ilara's breath away. 3 weeks ago, she'd been in the hospital, recovering from a minor, unexpected surgery. The mail had piled up, a dizzying stack of bills and junk. She hadn't opened anything that looked like official, threatening legal documents since she got back, burying them in a drawer to deal with when I feel better. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the terrifying reality of the situation sinking in. These were professionals, backed by a powerful entity, and they had papers. Her life, her home, was just a line item on their schedule. She pulled out her water-damaged phone, fingers fumbling over the screen. "I'm calling my lawyer, Mr. Davidson. He will shut this down." "You're welcome to," Bryce said. giving a fractional, almost imperceptible tilt of his head toward the operator of the excavator, a huge, silent man already climbing into the cab. "The work proceeds now." "We're on a tight schedule, Mrs. Vance." The machine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, a deafening sound that swallowed Ilara's frantic voice as she tried to get through to the automated answering service of her attorney's office. "I need a lawyer." "Press 1. If this is an emergency, press 2. She mashed 2, only to be put on hold with a cheerful, maddeningly upbeat jingle about estate planning and peace of mind. The excavator moved. The massive treads, thick and aggressive, chewed up the delicate turf her grandmother had nurtured for 50 years. Ilara watched, frozen on the deck, as the steel bucket, a wide, hungry maw tipped with razor-sharp teeth, bit into the soil with a sickening, grinding sound. The first scoop of earth, dark and rich with organic matter, was torn from her yard and dumped unceremoniously a few feet away, a mound of desecrated soil. It felt like an assault, a violation that went deeper than property damage. This wasn't just dirt. This was the garden where her grandmother had taught her to plant tulips, the lawn where her beloved childhood dog, Buster, was buried beneath the shade of the pear tree. This was hers, and strangers were ripping it open, searching for an unknown terror. Tears of helpless, paralyzing rage burned her eyes. She finally got through to Davidson's secretary, a woman named Carol who sounded bored and put upon by the early hour. "Mr. Davidson is in court, Mrs. Vance. He can't be disturbed." Carol's voice was tinny and distant over the deafening din of the machinery. "What is the nature of the emergency?" "There are men digging a massive hole in my backyard. They say they have an easement." Case 204B. "I need him to call them off now." Ilara screamed, having to cup her hand over the phone to hear herself. A moment of static silence. Case 204B. "That's a very old docket, Mrs. Vance, predating your current deed by decades. Property dispute, I think. Let me see. Oh, wait, yes, Sterling Development. They won the right to exploratory survey on the former Eldridge property lineage. Your house is on that land. The claim is complicated, something to do with an unresolved legacy issue from the original 1950s deed, which may or may not supersede your current title regarding subterranean rights to, well, to something valuable, to something—" Ilara shrieked, looking at the 2-foot-deep crater now forming in her lawn, the fountain now just a pile of rubble. "What the hell are they looking for, Carol? Oil? Gold? A lost city? Sterling Development is a billion-dollar commercial entity, not a historical society." "I couldn't say, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Davidson will review the file when he's back, but frankly, if they have a court order, you can't interfere." "Just wait, let them finish, let them finish." The words echoed with a chilling, cold finality. Ilara hung up, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone into the churning mud. There was no immediate help coming. The law, the foundation of order and ownership, had just been used as a wrecking ball against her. She walked carefully down the steps, across the mutilated lawn, and stopped at the edge of the deepening trench, now 4 feet down and widening fast. The smell of cold, turned earth mingled with the acrid scent of diesel exhaust. "Bryce!" she shouted over the noise, her voice cracking with the effort. The foreman walked over, pulling his safety glasses down to look her in the eye for the first time. His eyes were cold gray like river stones, hard and unyielding. "You need to step back, ma'am. This is unsafe." "I don't care about safety. I care about my land." "Tell me what Sterling Development is really looking for," she demanded, planting her feet. "The notice said subterranean survey. That's vague. This is an industrial excavation. What is the something you're looking for beneath my house?" Bryce sighed, an exasperated professional sound. He checked his watch, calculating how much time this woman was costing him. "The document is public record, Mrs. Vance. We're looking for an unregistered, non-metallic container, potentially of historical significance, referenced in the original Eldridge deed transfer, the one before your grandmother acquired the property in 1968. The original owner, a man named Silas Eldridge, was involved in a private historical society. The belief is that he buried a time capsule containing a key piece of local, potentially valuable history here before he vacated the premises." "A time capsule?" Ilara repeated, incredulous, ignoring the rising mud splashing against her bare ankles. If it was a time capsule, it's not buried 5 feet down, and you wouldn't need a heavy-duty excavator. This is personal. It has to be. What did Silas Eldridge bury here, Bryce? What did he hide? Bryce's impassivity cracked for a second. His jaw tightened. He hesitated, his gaze flickering back toward the pit and the ongoing destruction. Alara pressed her advantage, sensing she'd hit a nerve that transcended his professional detachment. Silas Eldridge. I heard my grandmother mention that name once. She always said the house had bad luck, that the energy was unsettled. That Eldridge fellow, didn't he disappear? Just vanished without a trace in the... The silence following Bryce's devastating declaration, they were looking for proof of murder, was thick, heavy and absolute, broken only by the frantic chirping of unseen crickets in the remaining hedges. The morning sun, now higher, cast long, accusatory shadows across the excavated pit, illuminating the confession clutched in the foreman's rigid hand and the desolate strongbox resting at Alara's feet. Alara's mind splintered, murder, grandmother, blame, under the oak. Each word was a cold shard of ice thrown against the fragile wall she'd built around her memory of the woman who had loved her, comforted her, and taught her the names of every weed in this yard. It was impossible. Her grandmother, Eleanor Vance, was a saint, the backbone of the neighborhood, the woman who baked pies for every funeral and never missed Sunday service. No, Alara choked out, taking an involuntary step back, away from the box, away from the pit, away from the man whose face was now a mask of pure professional terror. You don't know what that says. It's ancient, it's brittle, it's nonsense. It's a man's last joke, a sick trick to save a historical society from looking foolish. Bryce, however, wasn't listening to her. He was talking rapidly into his radio, his voice no longer the dead baritone of a field supervisor, but sharp and urgent. This is Alpha 1 to command. Primary objective located, confirmation of object type received. We have a significant shift in status. Repeat. Significant shift in status. We need immediate law enforcement liaison, a full forensics team, and a geotech unit on site. Secure the perimeter. No civilian contact? I repeat, no civilian contact. He lowered the radio, his eyes sweeping Alara's frantic face with a new, clinical intensity. The look of a man who suddenly realized the loose end he was speaking to was a potential accessory. Mrs. Vance, he stated, his voice regaining a steely control. You need to understand the gravity of this situation. I am calling the police. This is officially a crime scene dating back nearly 70 years. Everything we have is pointing to a serious, undocumented incident involving the original owner, Silas Eldridge. Given the language in this note and the explicit mention of the next owner, your grandmother, we are legally obligated to hand this over. You need to remain silent, remain calm, and do not, under any circumstances, touch the box, the note, or the ground near the oak. You want me to stand here and watch you accuse my dead grandmother of murder? Alara felt a hysterical laugh bubble up, sharp and painful. You tore my life open, Bryce! You came here looking for a time capsule, and now you're talking about corpses. You don't get to tell me to be silent. I'm telling you this for your own good, he countered, holding up the oilskin scroll like evidence of her impending doom. This note mentions a stolen item, but it frames the body under the oak as the rest of the blame. Stolen. Like a child. He gestured toward the chilling baby booty in the box. The Eldridge lineage has long believed Silas was framed for the disappearance of his infant daughter, Eliza, who vanished in 1954. If that note is a deathbed confession, this whole yard is about to become a grave site, and the owner who acquired the property right after the disappearance is going to be the first person the police talk to in before Alara could formulate a rebuttal, defense of a woman who had been dead for 10 years, new sound pierced the air. The distant, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens. It wasn't the single car of the local sheriff. It was the intense, insistent sound of multiple vehicles closing in fast. Sterling Development was moving with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate machine designed to manage maximum liability. Within 10 minutes, the entire front of Alara's quaint, forgotten house was clogged with unmarked black SUVs, a uniformed Havenwood police cruiser, and a beige van bearing the discreet logo of the State Bureau of Investigation. SBI. A woman in a sharp, dark suit, followed by two uniformed officers, marched across the shredded lawn, clipboard in hand, cutting an imposing figure against the suburban chaos. She didn't look at the excavator, the pit, or the strongbox. Her eyes went straight to Ilara. This was Detective Sergeant Leah Kincaid, and she exuded an air of methodical, exhausting competence. "Mrs. Ilara Vance?" Kincaid's voice was cool, controlled, and utterly lacking in human warmth. "I'm Sergeant Kincaid. This area is now under police jurisdiction. Mr. Bryce, give me the note and the site coordinates." Bryce practically leaped to hand over the confession, treating it like a toxic, high-value asset. Kincaid unfolded the brittle parchment with meticulous care, her gaze sweeping over the archaic handwriting. The two uniformed officers immediately placed yellow, police line, "Do not cross" tape around the entire perimeter of Ilara's property, sealing her inside the unfolding nightmare. "Mrs. Vance?" Kincaid said, not as a question but as a pronouncement, finally looking at Ilara. "We understand you are the current sole owner, having inherited the property from your grandmother, Eleanor Vance, a decade ago. Did your grandmother ever mention Silas Eldridge or any secret related to the land?" Ilara was reeling, the speed of the official response overwhelming her capacity to think straight. She saw the two other Sterling crew members standing by the excavator, watching her with blank faces. She realized the terrible, lonely position she was in. She was one woman, barefoot on wet grass, against a police force, a powerful legal trust, and a 60-year-old murder secret. "She mentioned he disappeared," Ilara managed, her voice steadier now, fueled by a defensive surge for Eleanor. "She said the house felt unsettled. That's all. And she told me once, when I was digging a flower bed, to never disturb the area around the oak's roots. She was superstitious. She had a lot of strange beliefs about the land." "Superstitious," Kincaid repeated, raising a skeptical eyebrow that spoke volumes. She turned and pointed sharply toward the huge oak, its ancient roots twisting out of the ground like enormous sleeping pythons. "Mr. Bryce's preliminary report indicates the confession directs us specifically to that oak. He has coordinates for a deeper secondary burial site near the main root crown. We need to ascertain if this document is credible, Mrs. Vance, and that means we must excavate the second site. Now." Kincaid looked at Bryce. "You have the geotech equipment? I want a full scan before you break ground, but I want eyes on the soil within the hour. No more heavy machinery near the tree for now. Hand tools only." The foreman nodded, galvanized back into action, the tension among the men palpable. Ilara lunged forward, her heart screaming in protest. "No, you can't. You can't touch that tree. It's over 100 years old. If you cut into those roots, you'll kill it. It'll fall on the house." Kincaid stepped directly into Ilara's path, her composure unwavering. "Mrs. Vance, we are operating under a standing court order and an active SBI warrant for homicide investigation. The life of a tree does not supersede the resolution of a murder. If you interfere with the investigation, you will be arrested. You are currently the sole link to the one person Silas Eldridge implicated besides himself. We need you to cooperate." "Cooperate?" Ilara whispered, the realization sinking in. She was not a victim of property damage anymore. She was a suspect. She looked at the giant, silent oak. The tree wasn't just a part of the house. It was the symbol of her grandmother's life here. Ilara remembered Eleanor, sitting under the massive canopy, knitting in the summer shade, a quiet, fierce sentinel watching the world go by. "Did you know, Grandma? Did you buy this home because you knew what it was hiding?" She retreated to the deck, sitting down heavily, watching the sterile, calculated violation unfold. The SBI forensics team arrived, setting up tripods and markers, treating her beloved sanctuary like a quarry. Bryce and the remaining crew, now under police supervision, began the agonizingly slow work of digging by hand around the oak's immense root crown. The men were quiet now, their movements cautious, respectful of the possibility of what they might find. As they dug, Ilara pulled herself together. She had to fight. She pulled her phone from her pocket and called her lawyer, Mr. Davidson, again, reaching him finally during a court recess. She explained the situation in sharp, frantic bursts, ending with the terrifying phrase, "They found a confession to murder and they think Grandma was involved." Davidson listened, aghast. "Ilara, stay out of the hole. Do not answer any questions without me present. I'm filing an emergency injunction now, challenging the scope of the Eldridge easement against the SBI warrant, but that takes time. For now, you must be silent." Ilara hung up, feeling marginally less adrift, but still trapped. She watched as one of Bryce's men, a stocky worker named Frank, knelt and began scraping at the dirt near one of the largest roots, a root as thick as a human torso. Frank suddenly stopped. He didn't shout. He didn't drop his shovel. He just looked down, then up at Bryce with wide, unnerved eyes. Bryce immediately rushed over, followed closely by Detective Kincaid. Ilara gripped the splintered railing of the deck, her knuckles white. She couldn't see the depth of the hole, but she could see Kincaid's reaction. A quick intake of breath, a tightening of her jaw, followed by the immediate grim order. "Everyone clear. I want a perimeter of 10 feet now. CSI, take over this section. Get a camera down there." Ilara could hear the low, frantic conversation that followed. Bryce spoke first, his voice strained. "It's non-metallic, Sergeant. Exactly as the original coordinates suggested. The mater." The name, Captain Charles Merritt, hit Ilara with the force of an indictment. It wasn't the answer to the mystery. It was the start of a completely new, far darker one. This wasn't a domestic tragedy, not a jealous neighbor, not a missing child. This was a man of war, listed as missing in action in a forgotten conflict, found buried secretly in the suburban dirt of Havenwood, years after the official end of the Korean War. Detective Kincaid, clutching the small, tarnished dog tag, didn't waste a second. She waved off the lingering Sterling crew and issued new orders to the SBI team. The small-scale excavation around the root crown instantly transitioned into a full, professional dig. Lights were deployed and the air filled with the whine of the chainsaw being tested. "Mrs. Vance, I'm going to give you one more chance to be truthful," Kincaid said, stepping onto the deck, her shadow looming over Ilara. The chain-link perimeter was now guarded by two young, silent officers. "Your grandmother, Eleanor Vance, bought this house 2 days after Silas Eldridge wrote a confession detailing a burial under the oak tree. The body belongs to a decorated officer who supposedly vanished in 1953. Did your grandmother, Eleanor Vance, have any connection, personal, professional, or otherwise, to the military, to the Eldridge family, or to Captain Charles Merritt?" Ilara shook her head, the adrenaline making her dizzy. "No, she was a homemaker. She worked at the library. Her life was small, predictable. I'm telling you, I've never heard that name. This is an impossible tangle." Eldridge was supposedly a local historian. "Why would he bury a soldier?" "The confession is only a piece of the puzzle, Mrs. Vance," Kincaid retorted, her voice hardening with suspicion. "The confession says he stole something, which we interpret as the child, Eliza. But the body under the oak is the rest of the blame. That suggests Eldridge was covering for a far more serious crime. The Eldridge Legal Trust stated their client was looking for evidence to clear Silas's name in his daughter's disappearance. They found something far worse, evidence of a cover-up for the murder of a soldier. And your grandmother, Mrs. Vance, bought this property in cash 2 days later at a fraction of its market value during a massive snowstorm where records are notoriously vague." Kincaid leaned close, her eyes boring into Ilara's. "The easiest conclusion is that your grandmother cleaned up the initial crime scene for someone, perhaps Eldridge, perhaps someone higher up involved in Merritt's disappearance. If she helped him bury a body, or if she was the one who pulled the trigger, that is the difference between accessory and first-degree murder. And the evidence is literally wrapped up in the roots of your favorite tree." A moment later, the chainsaw screamed to life. It was a guttural, terrifying sound, the sound of violence being done to nature and the irreversible destruction of Ilara's childhood memory. The first heavy-gauge steel chain bit into the trunk of the majestic oak. The cut was immediate, deep, and fatal. Ilara flinched, her eyes squeezed shut, unable to watch the brutal felling of her sanctuary. She used the noise, the intense, desperate, blinding noise that swallowed all other sound, as her moment. Kincaid was distracted, her attention fixed on the tree, watching the workers begin the arduous, dangerous task of slicing into the ancient hard wood. Ilara quickly glanced down at the strongbox Bryce had retrieved, which was still resting on the grass, marked with an evidence tag, but not yet sealed in a bag. The box itself was evidence, but the fragments of ancient newspaper used as lining were just trash. Moving with a swiftness born of sheer panic, Ilara knelt, pretending to weep into her hands, and with a single quick motion, she snatched a large, oil-stained corner piece of the shredded newspaper from the box lining. It was brittle, black with age, but she saw a clear, faded column heading 1956. She crushed the paper in her hand, shoving the tiny, fragile evidence deep into her wet sock. The entire action took less than 3 seconds. Kincaid turned back, her face grim. "The tree is down. We'll have the remains out within the hour. You're going inside now, Mrs. Vance. An officer will be stationed at your door. You are not to leave the premises." Ilara nodded numbly, the tiny piece of paper burning against her ankle. She walked into the house, which suddenly felt cold, hollow, and utterly foreign. Trapped inside, Ilara ran upstairs, the muffled, horrific sounds of the excavation still reaching her through the walls. She pulled the fragile newspaper fragment from her sock and flattened it on her grandmother's old writing desk. It was useless as a full document, but the column heading gave her a vital timeline. 1956. If the paper was used as packing material, Silas Eldridge buried the box after 1956, not 1954 when Eliza vanished. And years before Eleanor bought the house in 1968, she booted up her old laptop, her hands moving with the focused intensity of survival. She needed to know 2 things: who was Captain Charles Merritt, and what was his connection to the house and Silas Eldridge. A quick search of Captain Charles Merritt, Korean War, MIA 1953, brought up a surprisingly detailed file. Merritt was an intelligence officer, not a combat infantryman. He disappeared during a liaison mission in Seoul, rumored to be carrying sensitive defense schematics. The file ended with a note about an unsuccessful, highly classified search operation launched in 1954, led by a civilian specialist in cryptographic history, Silas Eldridge. Ilara stared at the screen. Eldridge wasn't just a history buff. He was a spy hunter, or perhaps a spy himself. He was looking for Merritt, but ended up burying him. The house was not a home. It was a consequence of Cold War intrigue, a site where an international intelligence operation had gone violently wrong. The second search was for the baby booty and the porcelain doll's head. Eliza Eldridge disappearance 1954. The results were scant, a few newspaper clippings. The key was a grainy photo of the Eldridge family, Silas, his wife, and the infant Eliza, in front of the Havenwood house. The article mentioned the widespread belief that Silas had cracked under the pressure of his government work and, in a moment of madness, had harmed the child, which explained his subsequent disappearance and the sale of the house. The confession was a lie. It was a complex, multi-layered lie designed to deflect attention from the murder of Captain Merritt, making it look like Eldridge was simply confessing to the death of his own daughter. Ilara gripped the keyboard. If Silas Eldridge was covering up the murder of an intelligence officer, and if her grandmother Eleanor bought the house 2 days after the confession, Eleanor wasn't an accessory to a local crime. She was likely a part of the cover-up. She suddenly remembered a peculiar detail from her childhood. Every Saturday, Eleanor would clean the living room, always dusting the small framed watercolor hanging above the fireplace. It was an abstract, geometric piece, something Ilara had always considered ugly, but Eleanor fiercely protected it. "It's a map, dear," she used to say with a strange, secretive smile. "It shows you where to put your feet. A map." Ilara ran downstairs. She ignored the watchful, uniformed officer at her door, who was instructed only to prevent her from leaving, not to prevent her movements inside. She stood in the living room, staring at the watercolor. It wasn't abstract. It was a crude, stylized drawing of the property boundary, but overlaid with thick, dark lines that mirrored the major root pattern of the old oak tree and centered over the fireplace hearth. Exactly where she was standing was a small, hand-drawn X. She moved the painting. Beneath it, the pale blue plaster wall was slightly discolored. She ran her fingers along the seam of the mantelpiece. There. A tiny, almost invisible line where a section of the wood paneling met the brick. She dug her fingernails in, pulling. The wood panel, perfectly flush with the wall, didn't budge. She needed a tool. She found her grandmother's old, heavy gardening trowel, the one she'd used in the flower beds. Away from the oak, in the utility closet. With the officer only a few feet away, outside the back window, Ilara worked quickly and silently. She jammed the trowel into the thin seam above the hearth and twisted. With a muffled groan of aged wood and concrete dust, the panel gave way. It wasn't a deep cavity, but inside, tucked into the dry, dark space was a small locked metal box. Not corroded like the first, this one was modern, a standard safety deposit box. Ilara broke the cheap latch with the trowel, the crack surprisingly loud in the silent house. She threw the lid open. Inside, there was no money, no jewels, and no more confessions. There were 3 items: a stack of 20 crisp, blank, military-issue dog tags, a small, beautifully preserved black and white photograph. It showed 3 people: Silas Eldridge, younger, smiling, standing next to a handsome man in a crisp army uniform, Captain Charles Merritt. But between them stood a young woman, strikingly beautiful and resolute, with a familiar, fierce light in her eyes. It was Eleanor Vance, a single, heavy, nickel-plated bullet, polished bright as silver, placed neatly on top of the photograph. Ilara dropped the trowel. The heavy bullet rolled across the floor, settling at her feet. She picked up the photograph, staring at her grandmother, young and radiant, standing shoulder to shoulder with the dead soldier buried beneath the oak tree. Eleanor knew them both. Eleanor was right in the middle of a love triangle, a theft, or an intelligence operation that had cost a man his life and defined the rest of hers. The quiet woman who baked pies and tended roses had spent her entire life safeguard. The sheer, dizzying scale of the deception rendered the morning sun cold and the air thin. Silas Eldridge, the supposed victim of a missing child case, the one who left the cryptic, self-incriminating confession, was himself the body under the oak. He had orchestrated his own burial, using Captain Charles Merritt's dog tag as a final, macabre flourish to ensure investigators would chase a ghost. Ilara stood paralyzed in the living room. The nickel-plated bullet, the photo of the smiling trio, and the stack of blank dog tags scattered on the hearth rug. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was not an accomplice to a simple murder. She was involved in a deep, terrifying Cold War-era double-cross. Detective Kincaid, her composure shattered by the discovery, was running toward the house, screaming at the officer by the door. "Vance, where is she? Get me the homeowner, now!" Ilara had seconds. She scooped the 3 critical pieces of evidence, the photo, the silver bullet, and the sheaf of blank dog tags, and jammed them into the pocket of the worn bathrobe she was wearing. She slammed the concealed panel shut with a dull thud, replacing the watercolor map just as the front door flew open. Kincaid stormed in, her face red with professional humiliation and mounting rage. She didn't look like a meticulous investigator anymore. She looked like a lioness whose prey had just mocked her. "The dog tag was bait, Mrs. Vance," Kincaid spat, marching toward Ilara, forcing her back toward the sofa. The Eldridge Legal Trust was looking for their ancestor, Silas. They found him murdered, with the ID of a missing military intelligence officer from 1953. This changes everything. This is no longer local homicide. This is potentially a federal espionage case. The only link we have is your grandmother, who bought the land 2 days after a man was buried in it. Kincaid's eyes, sharp and predatory, immediately raked over the living room, searching for the slightest sign of distress or hidden evidence. Ilara sat down hard, forcing herself to maintain a shell-shocked expression. "You said you were going to call your lawyer," Kincaid reminded her, crossing her arms. "I'm going to give you time to do that, but you are not leaving this house. The SBI is coming back to conduct a full forensic sweep of the interior, starting with this room. Did your grandmother leave you anything? A diary? Letters? Anything related to Silas Eldridge, Captain Merritt, or the military?" Ilara shook her head, tears finally welling up, genuine this time. "No, just the house. And her stories. She just told me to stay away from the oak. Smart woman, Kincaid muttered, taking a deep breath to regain control. But she made one fatal mistake. She didn't know her grandson-in-law's money would eventually fund a search for her victim. We're going to search the house, Mrs. Vance. If you have hidden anything, now is your last chance to turn it over. Kincaid left Ilara with the silent officer, stationed inside the room now, watching her every move. Ilara knew she couldn't let the SBI find the contents of her robe pocket, especially the nickel-plated bullet. It would instantly connect the murder weapon to her grandmother's safekeeping. Feigning a sudden collapse, Ilara stumbled toward the bathroom. I need a moment. I'm going to throw up. The officer, stiffly adhering to procedure, moved to follow her but stopped at the threshold of the small, cramped bathroom, giving her the bare minimum of privacy. Ilara locked the door. She moved to the window, which overlooked a narrow, overgrown flower bed on the side of the house. A neglected strip of ivy and concrete her grandmother had used as a dumping ground for worn-out gardening gloves and old terracotta pots. She pulled the 3 items from her pocket, the photograph, the bullet, and the dog tags. Using her gardening trowel, which she had carried with her, still covered in concrete dust, she pried up a single loose cobblestone near the window. It revealed a shallow, dry pit of packed earth. Working with the speed of pure instinct, Ilara carefully placed the photograph, the stack of blank dog tags, and the single heavy bullet into the pit, covering them with a thin layer of soil and replacing the cobblestone. It was a terrible risk, but the entire backyard was being photographed and dug up. The front door was watched. This forgotten, insignificant side plot was the only blind spot left. She flushed the toilet, splashed cold water on her face, and emerged, looking pale and fragile. The officer ushered her back to the living room just as a team of 3 SBI evidence technicians began setting up equipment. The waiting was unbearable. Ilara sat, forced to watch strangers dismantle the last physical memories of her grandmother, but the forced stillness allowed her to think. The newspaper fragment had given her the window, 1956. The confession was dated 1968. Eldridge was murdered sometime between 1956 and 1968. The photo proved the personal stakes. Eleanor knew both men intimately. The bullet suggested the method. The dog tag suggested the cover-up. But what did Silas Eldridge do between 1954, Eliza's disappearance, and 1956, the newspaper date, that led to his murder? When her lawyer, Mr. Davidson, finally arrived, he was frantic, haggard, and clearly out of his depth. He immediately demanded Kincaid stop the interior search and secure a private conversation with his client. "They've got nothing on you, Ilara," Davidson whispered once Kincaid reluctantly left the room. "The confession is inadmissible, a historical document. The body is Eldridge's, found on the property he owned. Your only connection is inheriting the house. You need to keep quiet and let me negotiate this down to a property dispute." "He was killed with a nickel-plated bullet, Mr. Davidson," Ilara whispered back, staring into the middle distance. "My grandmother had one hidden in the wall." She knew both men. The confession was a way to make his murder look like a historical oddity, to protect someone, maybe herself. Davidson stared at her, horrified. "Ilara, stop! You cannot give them this. You cannot lead them to a murder weapon." "I have to know what happened to Captain Charles Merritt," Ilara insisted, ignoring him. "He was alive in 1953, rumored to be carrying sensitive defense schematics. Eldridge was hired to find him. But if Eldridge was killed and buried here, where is Merritt? He didn't just vanish, he was an intelligence operative. His disappearance must be the real secret Eleanor was protecting." Davidson, realizing he couldn't control her, relented slightly. "Fine. We need to find out what happened in the mid-50s that connects a missing soldier, an intelligence agent, and your grandmother. I'll get a court order to unseal historical government records. But you are not going anywhere." "Too slow," Ilara said, standing up. "My grandmother worked at the Havenwood Public Library for 40 years. She didn't just shelve books. She had access to the local archives, the microfilm of every local and regional newspaper, every obscure zoning document. I know where she'd hide the truth if she wanted it found." Before Davidson could protest, Ilara marched to the kitchen. She picked up a simple, antique copper pot that sat on the windowsill, a pot Eleanor had always said was the most trustworthy thing in the house. She lifted the lid. Inside, tucked beneath the scouring pad, was a single laminated strip of microfilm. Kincaid, drawn back by the sound of Ilara's movement, watched as Ilara held up the film. "You're not going to get this, Sergeant," Ilara announced, her voice strong and clear. "This is not evidence. This is a single strip of microfilm from the library archives. It relates to the house's original zoning petition. If you seize it, you'll simply be delaying your search for the man who actually killed Silas Eldridge." Kincaid knew the legal gray area was too wide to risk seizure without a specific warrant. She let Ilara call an Uber, sending 2 plainclothes officers to follow her. Ilara sped toward the library, Davidson frantically driving his own car to keep up. At the library, which felt like a ghost town compared to the war zone in her yard, Ilara walked straight to the back, to the ancient humming microfilm reader. She threaded the strip, her fingers shaking slightly with anticipation. The film scrolled through mundane legal documents, historical society minutes, and then a single, faded newspaper page from the Havenwood Gazette, June 1957. The headline was small, buried in the back section, "Local Specialist Eldridge Abruptly Ends Classified Govt Search." The accompanying story detailed Silas Eldridge's return from an unspecified mission, his decision to abandon the search for Captain Charles Merritt, and his subsequent institutionalization for supposed paranoid delusion after he claimed the U.S. government was actively covering up a major intelligence leak, codenamed Puck's Gambit. Eldridge claimed the schematics Merritt carried were not military, but cryptographic keys to a vast network of American informants in the Soviet bloc. He also claimed the man who murdered Merritt and took the schematics was living under an alias in Havenwood, protected by powerful people. Ilara's eyes darted to the next paragraph, the true core of Eleanor's secret. It stated that Eldridge, upon his return, was briefly put under the care of a newly licensed government nurse, who was given the task of ensuring his silence and eventual commitment to an asylum. The nurse's name was Eleanor Vance. Ilara leaned back, the truth hitting her with the force of a physical impact. Eleanor wasn't just a neighbor or a lover, she was Eldridge's handler, placed there by a powerful agency. She was meant to silence him. But the photo, the love triangle, the fact that Eldridge was murdered and Eleanor then bought the house. Eleanor had been sent to kill Silas Eldridge to protect the government's secrets, but she had Faye. The news of Clara Eldridge's dog tag being found, the second marker, the one confirming the wife murdered her husband and escaped, sent a tremor through the quiet library. The 2 plainclothes officers, momentarily distracted by Kincaid's frantic phone call, snapped back to attention, one moving to block the aisle, the other lunging for Ilara. "Mrs. Vance, you are coming with us. Now. This is no longer a choice," the first officer commanded. Ilara didn't move. She held the crumpled note from her grandmother. The final piece was hidden by the only person I could trust to keep it safe, his widow, and stared at the blank dog tags peeking out of her robe pocket. She had only one move left, a desperate gambit based on a 70-year-old love affair. "I know where she hid it," Ilara said, looking past the officers to her lawyer, Mr. Davidson, who had just arrived, white-faced and terrified. "Not the body, the proof. The Puck's Gambit schematics. Eldridge was murdered because he was about to expose the deepest secrets of the Eldridge Trust. Their ancestors are the men who used the schematics to betray our country. If you want justice for Silas Eldridge, let me prove his murder was a consequence of treason." Davidson, sensing the high stakes and recognizing the potential federal dimension, finally found his voice. "Gentlemen, my client is cooperating under duress with an SBI investigation into an active conspiracy. You have no right to detain her without a formal charge. She is offering to lead you to evidence that will unmask a massive intelligence leak. If you stop her now, you become accessories to the cover-up." The officers hesitated, glancing nervously at each other. The word conspiracy had the desired effect. Ilara didn't wait. She turned, walking calmly through the microfilm aisle, Out the main doors and straight to Mr. Davidson's waiting. Pristine sedan. We need to go to the Havenwood Cemetery. Mr. Davidson, Ilara ordered, slamming the passenger door shut. And you need to get me a pen and paper fast. The blank dog tags are the key, but I need to decipher my grandmother's code. As Davidson sped away, with the two plainclothes officers in heavy pursuit, Ilara spread out the 5 blank dog tags and the photograph of Eleanor, Silas, and Captain Merritt. Eleanor's note said Silas was killed in the attempt to steal the proof, and the proof was hidden by the widow, Clara. Merritt and Clara ran away together. But where would Eleanor, the former government handler, tell them to hide the secrets of Puck's gambit? I kept the secret safe. Now the only thing that matters is the last piece. The dog tags are blank because the final piece of the puzzle isn't buried here. It was hidden by the only person I could trust to keep it safe. His widow. Ilara stared at the blank tags. They weren't meant to be inscribed with names. They were meant to be used for encoding. The number of tags was 5. The number of people involved in the deception was 5. Silas, the dead victim. Clara, the wife, murderer. Merritt, the soldier lover. Eleanor, the handler, protector. And little Eliza, the missing child, cover-up. She remembered one of her grandmother's strange library anecdotes. Told over and over, a good library is only as good as its cross-reference system. Look not for the book, but for the book that references the book. The Havenwood Cemetery was the town's oldest cross-reference. At the cemetery, Ilara directed Davidson to the oldest section, near the original plot map engraved in granite. The pursuing police cars screeched to a halt at the main gate, their occupants unsure if they could interfere with a client-attorney privileged investigation on private grounds. The cemetery is organized by the first letter of the surname and the year of death, Ilara whispered, adrenaline thrumming in her ears. The key is a sequence. 5 people, 5 tags. Eleanor used the 5 people involved to create the coordinates. She grabbed the dog tags. She assigned a tag to each person based on the photograph and the revelation. Silas Eldridge, 1968, murder victim, Clara Eldridge. 1957, fugitive wife, Charles Merritt, 1953, missing lover, Eleanor Vance. 2014, the protector, Eliza Eldridge. 1954, missing child. Ilara pulled a pen from Davidson and began writing a sequence on the blank tags using the cemetery's system. Last name, initial, and year of event tag. 1. E68, Silas's burial, tag. 2. V14, Eleanor's death, tag. 3. E57, Silas's institutionalization, Clara's. Escape, tag 4, M53, Merritt's disappearance. Tag 5, E54. Eliza's disappearance, it was gibberish. Frustrated, Ilara looked at the photo of the 3 young people again, Eleanor standing between the 2 men. It wasn't about the events. It was about the sequence of their protection. Eleanor protected Clara and Merritt first. Then she protected herself. Then she protected the lie that led to Eldridge's death. New sequence, Merritt, M53, Clara, E57, Eleanor, V14, Silas, E68, Eliza, E54. This sequence meant nothing to the cemetery map. Ilara slumped against a weathered headstone. It has to be simpler, she breathed. Eleanor always said the simplest lie is the most enduring. Then she looked at the blank tags and the dog tag of Captain Merritt that Kincaid had found. Merritt's dog tag was the first clue. The blank tags were the last. The entire story was about their escape. Ilara flipped the blank dog tags over. On the back of one, Eleanor had meticulously scratched a tiny symbol, a stylized owl, Puck's gambit. Puck was a mythical creature, a trickster, often associated with owls and hidden locations. Ilara's mind flashed back to her house. The one object Eleanor insisted was trustworthy, the copper pot that held the microfilm. The copper pot, Ilara whispered, jumping up. Where is the copper pot buried? Davidson looked confused. Ilara, we're at a cemetery. The house is surrounded. No, Ilara said, her eyes blazing with sudden certainty. Clara and Merritt escaped to a place Eleanor knew well. Eleanor's greatest love in life wasn't the house. It was the library. The most trusted physical object in her house was the copper pot. The most trusted person was Clara. The clue isn't here, Mr. Davidson, Ilara realized. It's in the children's history section of the library, where Eleanor spent most of her career, in a book about local history that hasn't been checked out in 60 years. Back at the library, Kincaid and her officers had arrived, blocking the main entrance. Kincaid strode toward Ilara, her face a thundercloud. "You led my officers on a chase, Mrs. Vance, to a graveyard. Enough games. The Eldridge Trust lawyers are on their way and they've secured a federal injunction. They have a right to your family's assets relating to the Eldridge estate. We know the dog tags were a lie, and we now believe Captain Merritt and Clara Eldridge are alive." "Where are they?" Ilara faced Kincaid, clutching Davidson's arm. "They're safe. But the schematics, the keys to Puck's gambit, are not. The Eldridge Trust doesn't want justice. They want to bury the truth their grandfathers committed treason to protect. I am going to expose them." "You have 5 minutes to show me where you're going," Kincaid growled. "Or I charge you with obstruction." Ilara walked straight past the front desk, toward the dimly lit back corner of the library, the local history section. She walked past the Havenwood Gazette microfilms and stopped at the children's history alcove. She knew her grandmother would choose a place of comfort and low surveillance. She ran her hand along a dusty shelf. The early days of Havenwood. She pulled out a thin, heavily bound book published in 1958. It was a history of local industry, rarely consulted. The police officers and Davidson watched in tense silence. Ilara opened the book to a page detailing local mining operations. She saw it immediately. Taped inside the back cover, beneath a faded inscription, was a small blank military-issue dog tag, the 6th and final piece. But this one was not blank. Engraved on it, meticulously and faintly, were 2 words, Copperhead Ranch. The copper pot was a reference to the Copperhead Ranch. Ilara looked up, her heart pounding. The Copperhead Ranch. It's a decommissioned mining estate in rural Montana. It was owned by a subsidiary of the largest defense contractor in the 1950s, the same one Eldridge accused of treason. Before Kincaid could react, a new contingent entered the library. They were 3 men in suits, not lawyers, but cold, angular figures who moved with military precision. They were flanked by a smirking, impeccably dressed man, the chief counsel for the Eldridge Trust. "Detective Kincaid, we have the federal injunction," the lawyer stated smoothly, presenting a document. "All items related to the Eldridge estate are now federal property. This includes any documents, artifacts, or intelligence recovered from the premises, or found by Mrs. Vance." He pointed at the book. "Give us the dog tag, Mrs. Vance." Ilara looked from the Eldridge Trust lawyer to the 3 dark figures, then to the dog tag in her hand, the location of the missing couple, and the schematics. She had to make her grandmother's final act of protection count. In a move of raw, visceral defiance, Ilara ripped the dog tag out of the book, snapped it in half, and then, using the weight of the massive history book, she smashed the 2 pieces of metal against the shelf, grinding the engraving into illegible powder. "It's gone," Ilara stated, looking the Eldridge Trust lawyer straight in the eye. "The coordinates are destroyed. You only have the name, Copperhead Ranch, Montana." The lawyer's smooth facade cracked, replaced by a look of sheer, lethal fury. The 3 suits moved with stunning speed, seizing Ilara and her lawyer. "You have just destroyed federal property," the lawyer shrieked. "You will be charged with treason." Karma, justice, and final irony, just as Ilara was being roughly ecchi.